The soft glow of candlelight flickered against the polished wooden tables of La Belle Note, one of Los Angeles's most elegant restaurants. The air was rich with the scent of aged wine and freshly seared filet mignon, a symphony of clinking glasses and hushed conversations filling the space. It was the kind of place where every meal was an event, where the wealthy and the powerful gathered to indulge in exquisite dining, shielded from the outside world by velvet curtains and impeccable service. Amidst the sea of tailored suits and designer dresses, Walter and Helen Carter, an elderly couple in their late 70s, sat quietly at a small corner table. Tonight was their 50th wedding anniversary, a milestone few could reach, and one they had promised themselves they would celebrate in style, despite their financial struggles. Helen, her silver hair carefully pinned back, adjusted the pearls around her neck, a sentimental gift from decades past. Walter, his hands rough from years of hard work as a carpenter, offered her a soft smile. They had scrimped and saved for this one evening, a single night of luxury, to remember the love that had carried them through all these years. "You look beautiful, my love," Walter said, squeezing her hand. Helen chuckled, brushing a strand of hair from his forehead. "And you, Mr. Carter, still make my heart race, even after all this time." Their eyes locked in a moment of pure affection, but beneath their smiles lay an unspoken truth: this night was a stretch for them. The rising cost of Walter's medical bills had drained their savings, and their once comfortable life had slowly been reduced to careful budgeting and small sacrifices. But for tonight, they wanted to forget all of that. Across the room, Leonardo DiCaprio sat alone at his usual table, dressed in a simple yet refined black suit, his presence both understated and commanding. He often dined here, preferring the quiet elegance of the restaurant over the chaos of Hollywood's glitzy social scene. With his tousled blonde hair and sharp features, he exuded an effortless charm, yet tonight, his piercing blue eyes held a trace of exhaustion. As he sipped his wine, his gaze drifted toward the Carters. He had noticed them earlier, an old couple lost in their own world, holding hands as if they were still young lovers. It was the kind of love that money couldn't buy, fame couldn't replicate. Something about them made him pause. Unbeknownst to him, the night was about to take an unexpected turn. A moment of quiet dignity would soon spiral into humiliation, until a single act would change everything. The waiter arrived at the Carters' table with an air of impatience, his black vest neatly pressed, his name tag reading Ethan in gold lettering. He barely looked at them as he poured their water, his attention flickering toward the high-profile guests scattered around the restaurant. His movements were efficient but dismissive, the kind of service reserved for those who, in his mind, didn't belong here. Helen and Walter noticed the difference immediately, the warmth in his voice when he greeted the wealthy patrons, the effortless smiles he offered to the men in tailored suits and women dripping in diamonds. For them, however, there was no charm, no unnecessary politeness, just a thinly veiled condescension that made Helen's fingers tighten around her napkin. Walter, always the optimist, ignored it. "We're ready to order," he said, clearing his throat as he looked down at the menu they had studied long before arriving, carefully choosing what they could afford without drawing attention to themselves. Ethan barely concealed a sigh. "What will it be?" His tone was bored, his pen already tapping against the small leather notepad. Helen forced a smile, determined to keep the night special. "We'll share the filet mignon, medium, with a side of roasted asparagus, please." She hesitated before adding, "and a glass of house red." "Just one." Ethan lifted an eyebrow. "Just one." The judgment was subtle but sharp enough to make Walter shift in his seat. Helen nodded, her smile unwavering, though inside she felt a familiar sting of humiliation. Ethan scribbled the order, clearly uninterested, then turned away without another word. Walter exhaled slowly, glancing at his wife, who was already straightening her posture, refusing to let something so small ruin their night. They had faced real struggles, endured losses far greater than a waiter's rudeness, and tonight was about them, not about the approval of a stranger who knew nothing of their journey. Across the room, Leonardo DiCaprio had seen everything. He wasn't one to interfere in others' business, but the quiet dignity of the elderly couple contrasted so starkly with the indifference of the waiter that something in him stirred. He continued watching, his expression unreadable, as their food arrived, one plate, carefully divided, one glass of wine, passed between them, while around them, waiters effortlessly delivered bottle after bottle of vintage champagne to younger guests who laughed loudly, their voices filling the air. Walter and Helen were invisible to them. As the night progressed, they tried to ignore the occasional sideways glances from the staff, the unspoken question in their eyes. "What are you doing here?" They focused instead on the meal, on the warmth of each other's presence, on the memories that had brought them here. They whispered about the first time they had met, the struggles of their early years, the day their son was born, the day he left home to build a life of his own. Their love had survived decades of uncertainty, and now, even in the face of financial hardship, it remained unshaken. Then, the bill arrived. Ethan placed it on the table with a single, practiced motion, not even bothering to say, "Take your time." Instead, he lingered just a second too long, his posture stiff, his impatience barely concealed. Walter hesitated before reaching for the small leather folder, his hand steady, but his chest tightening. He already knew what it would say. He had calculated it in his head beforehand, ensuring that they had enough. But as he opened it, scanning the total, his heart skipped a beat. It was more than he expected. The wine, though they had ordered the cheapest glass, had been upgraded without their knowledge, the small adjustment bringing the total to a number just beyond what they had planned for. Walter glanced at Helen, his lips parting as if to say something, but the words caught in his throat. Helen didn't ask. She already knew. Walter reached for his worn leather wallet, fingers shaking just slightly as he took out the credit card they had agreed to use. He placed it on the table, turning it over once, as if reassuring himself that it would be enough. Ethan scooped it up with a quick, indifferent nod, disappearing toward the register without a second glance. Helen reached for Walter's hand under the table, squeezing it gently. "It's fine, my love," she whispered, her voice steady, though her chest felt heavy. "It's just a few dollars more. It's nothing." Walter forced a smile, but he didn't answer. Across the restaurant, DiCaprio had seen this scene before. Not with them specifically, but with people like them, those who had spent a lifetime working hard, only to find themselves in a world that no longer seemed to respect that. He watched as Ethan returned, the card in his hand, his face blank, but his posture saying everything. It was declined. Helen's breath caught in her throat. Walter froze. Ethan said it just loud enough for the nearby tables to hear, his tone neither apologetic nor discreet. It was a statement, a cold fact delivered with the same bored detachment as every other part of his service. He held out the card as if it were contaminated, his fingers barely gripping the edges. Helen's face flushed deep red, her hands instinctively clasping together on her lap, her mind racing through possible solutions. Walter swallowed hard. That can't be right. His voice, once strong and certain, wavered just slightly. He reached for his wallet again, already knowing that they had no other card to offer, that this was all they had prepared for. Ethan sighed, shifting his weight to one side, his annoyance now visible. "We can try again, but Yes," Walter said quickly, his pride forcing him to meet the waiter's gaze. "Please, try again." Ethan took the card with a deliberate slowness, shaking his head just enough to make it clear that he expected the same result. He turned and walked back toward the register, his back straight, his steps firm, as if this was just another inconvenience in his shift. Helen's hands trembled. She felt the weight of the room, the way nearby guests were suddenly too quiet, the way eyes darted toward them, then away, as if pretending they hadn't heard. Walter's jaw tightened, his hands pressing against the table, his dignity hanging by a thread. A few moments passed before Ethan returned. Without a word, he shook his head. The card had been declined again. Walter exhaled, pressing a hand to his forehead. Helen felt sick, her stomach twisting, her vision blurring for just a second. She could barely process the moment before Ethan spoke again. "You need to figure this out," he said, crossing his arms. "That's not my problem." A long, excruciating silence followed. And then, just before the humiliation could settle in completely, a voice from across the room cut through the tension like a blade. "I'll handle it." Every head turned toward the source. Leonardo DiCaprio had put down his glass of wine, his expression unreadable, his voice calm but commanding. The restaurant fell into an unnatural silence. The moment Leonardo DiCaprio's voice cut through the air, every conversation around them ceased, every curious gaze turned in his direction. He had spoken without raising his voice, yet the authority behind his words was undeniable. The waiter, Ethan, hesitated for a fraction of a second, his arms still crossed, his posture stiff. His eyes flickered toward DiCaprio, and for the first time that evening, he looked uncertain. The Carters, still frozen in their seats, barely breathed. Helen clutched Walter's hand under the table, her fingers ice-cold, her heart hammering in her chest. Walter's shoulders stiffened as he instinctively straightened his back, the weight of humiliation still pressing down on him. They hadn't asked for help. They hadn't even considered it an option. The idea that a stranger, especially someone like him, had just intervened left them disoriented. Ethan blinked, his lips pressing together in hesitation before he responded. "Sir, this isn't..." DiCaprio didn't let him finish. He stood up slowly, moving with the kind of unshaken confidence that made people listen before they even realized why. He reached into his jacket pocket, pulled out his wallet, and extracted his black card, holding it between two fingers. His gaze, sharp and unreadable, locked onto Ethan's as he spoke in the same calm, measured tone. "Bring the check here. I'll take care of it." The tension in the room shifted, no longer just focused on Walter and Helen, but on the dynamic between DiCaprio and Ethan. The waiter hesitated, his stance wavering as he tried to process what was happening. He had spent his evening catering to guests who flaunted their wealth, who expected to be treated like royalty. Yet here was DiCaprio, a man who could have had the entire staff at his beck and call if he wanted, standing up for two elderly customers who had barely been acknowledged all night. Ethan's fingers twitched, as if debating whether to argue. Then, after a brief, internal calculation, he took a slow breath, exhaled through his nose, and gave a stiff nod. "I'll be back with the bill." His voice lacked the confidence he had displayed earlier. Without waiting for a response, he turned on his heel and walked toward the register, his movements a little sharper, his jaw visibly clenched. Walter finally found his voice, though it came out weaker than he intended. "That's not necessary," he said, his words directed at DiCaprio, but there was no force behind them. It was a statement made out of pride, out of the same instinct that had kept him going through decades of hardship without asking for a handout. DiCaprio slid his wallet back into his pocket and studied the man across from him, his expression unreadable. When he finally spoke, his tone was even, without an ounce of pity or condescension. "You shouldn't have to feel humiliated just for having dinner with your wife." Helen's throat tightened at the simple honesty in his words. There was no poor you in his voice, no false sympathy, just an understanding that went deeper than wealth or status. Walter opened his mouth to respond, but the weight of the evening, the exhaustion of years spent making ends meet, the sharp sting of being treated like an inconvenience in a place they had come to celebrate, it all caught up to him at once. His shoulders slumped slightly. He didn't argue again. Ethan returned with the check, setting it down on the table in front of DiCaprio without a word. He took out the card reader and ran the payment without hesitation, the small beep confirming the transaction. It was done. No fuss. No spectacle. Just one simple action that erased the entire ordeal. For a few moments, no one moved. Helen looked at her husband, her fingers still wrapped around his, the warmth of his touch grounding her. Walter exhaled, slowly, as if letting go of something that had been weighing on him. He turned toward DiCaprio, and when he spoke, his voice was quieter but steady. "Thank you." DiCaprio simply nodded. "Enjoy your anniversary." Ethan, still standing by the table, shifted uncomfortably. He was keenly aware of the fact that everyone in the restaurant had seen what had just happened. He cleared his throat, attempting to salvage whatever professionalism he had left. "Would you like anything else?" The question was forced, his voice lacking the same sharpness he had used earlier. Helen shook her head, offering a polite smile, though there was an unmistakable firmness behind it. "No, I think we're done for the night." Ethan nodded quickly and disappeared, moving to another part of the restaurant, clearly eager to remove himself from the situation. Walter turned back to DiCaprio, still visibly struggling with the complex emotions of the moment. He had been ready to find another way, to leave the restaurant with his pride intact, even if it meant walking out into the night not knowing how they would make up for the unexpected bill. And yet, as much as it pained him to have needed someone's help, there was no shame in the way it had been offered. There was no arrogance, no expectation of gratitude, just a simple, unspoken understanding. DiCaprio, sensing the weight of the moment, broke the silence with something neither of them expected. "This place is overrated anyway." For a split second, Walter didn't react. Then, he let out a quiet laugh, the tension in his shoulders loosening. Helen chuckled softly beside him, shaking her head as if she couldn't believe what had just happened. The moment felt lighter, less like an act of charity and more like something else entirely, a reminder that, at the end of the day, money didn't determine a person's worth. Walter extended his hand, his grip firm and sincere as DiCaprio shook it. "We won't forget this." DiCaprio simply nodded again, but before he could turn away, Helen, her voice gentle yet full of quiet strength, spoke up. "Neither will we." As they gathered their things and prepared to leave, the restaurant slowly returned to its usual rhythm, conversations resuming, the clinking of glasses filling the air once more. But something had shifted. People had watched, had witnessed what had happened, and whether they admitted it or not, they would leave with a different perspective than they had when they first arrived. Walter and Helen walked out hand in hand, the night air cool against their skin, their steps lighter than before. And somewhere inside, Leonardo DiCaprio returned to his table, picked up his glass of wine, and let the moment settle in his mind before moving on as if nothing had happened. Except it had happened. And for the people who had been there, it wouldn't be forgotten. The drive home was quiet. Walter's hands rested firmly on the steering wheel, his eyes fixed on the road ahead, but his mind replayed the night in fragments, the waiter's impatience, the glances from other guests, the moment the card had been declined. The weight of being judged for something no one in that room could possibly understand. He had worked his entire life, built furniture with his hands, never once lived beyond his means, and yet, in that single moment, he had felt stripped of his dignity. It wasn't about the money. It wasn't about whether they could afford a meal or not. It was about the way the world looked at them when they couldn't pay. Helen, sitting beside him, reached for his hand, her fingers gently brushing against his. She didn't say anything at first, just let the warmth of her touch ease the tension in his shoulders. Finally, after a long pause, she spoke, her voice soft but unwavering. "I know what you're thinking." Walter exhaled through his nose, shaking his head slightly. "Do you?" His tone wasn't sharp, but it carried the weight of everything he hadn't said. Helen didn't let go of his hand. "You're embarrassed," she continued, ignoring his attempt to brush it off. "You're angry. Not at him, not at what he did, but at the fact that we needed someone to do it." Walter's grip on the wheel tightened, his knuckles whitening. "We shouldn't have needed help," he admitted, his voice quieter now. "Not after all these years. Not after everything we've done to take care of ourselves." Helen sighed, looking out the window as the streetlights cast passing shadows on the car interior. "And if it had been someone else?" she asked after a moment. "If we had seen another couple struggling, if we had the means to step in, wouldn't we have done the same thing?" Walter glanced at her, his jaw tight. "That's different." Helen turned her head to face him fully. "Why?" Walter didn't answer right away. He wanted to say that it was because it had happened to them, that it was different when you were the one on the receiving end, when you were the one being stared at like you didn't belong. He had spent his whole life earning respect, working through pain, never once asking for a shortcut, and tonight, in front of strangers who didn't know a thing about him, he had been made to feel like he was less than them. But the truth was, it wasn't different. If they had seen another couple going through what they had just experienced, if they had the ability to make it right, he wouldn't have hesitated. He would have done it without thinking twice. Helen saw the shift in his expression the moment the realization settled. She gave his hand another squeeze before finally letting go, allowing him to sit with the thought in silence. They pulled into their driveway, the small, familiar house standing against the dark sky, its porch light flickering faintly. Walter killed the engine but didn't move to get out right away. Helen waited. After a few moments, Walter finally sighed, rubbing a hand over his face. "I just don't want to be in that position again," he admitted. "I don't want to feel that way again." Helen nodded, understanding without needing him to explain further. "We won't be," she said simply, then reached for the door handle, stepping out before he could argue. Walter followed, closing the car door behind him and locking it with a soft click. Inside, the house was quiet, the familiarity of home settling around them. Helen made her way to the kitchen, setting her purse down on the counter before opening the fridge. Walter sat at the small wooden table, running his fingers over the edges, the old grooves from years of use smooth under his touch. Helen pulled out 2 glasses, poured some water, and sat across from him, sliding one toward him without a word. He took a sip, setting the glass down carefully before looking up at her. "I still don't understand why he did it," he admitted. "He didn't know us. He had no reason to care." Helen smiled faintly, taking a sip of her own. "Maybe that's exactly why he did it." Walter frowned. "What do you mean?" Helen leaned forward slightly, resting her elbows on the table. "The people who do things expecting something in return, those aren't the ones who change the world. It's the ones who do something when they don't have to, when they have no reason other than the fact that it's the right thing to do. Those are the people who leave a mark." Walter considered her words, staring at the water in his glass as if it held some kind of answer. After a long moment, he finally nodded. "I just don't know how to thank him." Helen tilted her head. "Maybe we don't have to." Walter raised an eyebrow, and she smiled softly. "Maybe we just find a way to do the same for someone else." Walter exhaled through his nose, shaking his head with a small, tired chuckle. "You always do that." Helen lifted an eyebrow. "Do what?" "Make me see things differently." She smirked, lifting her glass in a small, playful toast. "That's what 50 years of marriage will do." Walter shook his head again, but this time, his smile was genuine. He picked up his glass, clinking it lightly against hers before taking another sip. The weight in his chest didn't fully disappear, but it felt lighter than before. Maybe Helen was right. Maybe gratitude didn't always need words. Maybe the best way to thank someone wasn't with an apology or an explanation, but with action. As they sat in the quiet comfort of their home, neither of them knew that across the city, Leonardo DiCaprio was sitting in his own home, reflecting on the night just as they were. He hadn't done it for recognition, hadn't done it for the look of gratitude in their eyes. He had done it because he had been in rooms like that before, had seen people treated as if they didn't matter, had watched the way the world decided who deserved kindness and who didn't. He had done it because it was the kind of thing that should have been normal, not remarkable. He had done it because, at the end of the day, it wasn't about him. And that was what made all the difference. The following morning, Walter sat at the kitchen table, a fresh cup of coffee steaming in front of him. He wasn't drinking it. His hands were wrapped around the ceramic mug, his gaze distant. The previous night played in his mind, every detail replaying like a loop he couldn't break: the waiter's voice, the weight of the bill in his hands, the moment the card was declined, the eyes watching, the stranger stepping in without hesitation. Helen moved quietly around the kitchen, her hands busy with the routine of the morning, but she glanced at him now and then, waiting for him to speak. She finally sat across from him, placing a small plate with toast in front of him, though she knew he wouldn't eat right away. He was still thinking. He was still caught between the gratitude and the discomfort of what had happened. "You didn't sleep much," she said, watching him carefully. Walter sighed, rubbing a hand over his face before leaning back in his chair. "I kept thinking about it." Helen took a sip of her tea. "About what?" Walter exhaled. "Everything. How we ended up there, what it felt like. How he paused, shaking his head. "I don't understand why it's bothering me so much. I should just be grateful and move on." Helen studied him for a moment before setting her cup down. "It's because it wasn't just about dinner." Walter looked up at her, his jaw tightening slightly. He knew she was right, but he wasn't sure he wanted to hear it out loud. Helen continued. "It was about feeling like we didn't belong. It was about someone deciding, just by looking at us, that we weren't worth the same treatment as everyone else in that room. And then, in the same moment, someone else deciding the opposite." Walter's hands tensed around his cup. "It shouldn't take someone like him to make that kind of difference," he muttered. "Why did it have to be Leonardo DiCaprio? Why is it that people only listen when it's someone like him?" Helen tilted her head. Maybe because he knew that too. Walter frowned, but before he could answer, the phone rang. Helen reached for it, pressing it to her ear with her usual warmth. "Hello." Walter watched as her expression shifted slightly, her posture straightening, her lips parting in a way that told him something unexpected had just been said. She nodded, listening intently. "Yes, this is she." A pause. "I'm sorry, could you repeat that?" Walter leaned forward, his heartbeat picking up. Helen was too still now, her fingers gripping the phone just a little tighter. He could hear the faint murmur of a voice on the other end, but not enough to make out the words. Helen's lips parted again, but no sound came out at first. When she finally spoke, her voice wavered. "No. I don't understand. Who would it?" Walter stood, moving toward her now, his stomach twisting. "Helen?" She barely registered his voice, her eyes still wide with disbelief. "You're saying all of it?" Another pause. "No outstanding balance? Nothing?" Walter felt his breath catch. Helen's grip on the phone tightened, and for the first time, her eyes filled with tears. I don't know what to say." She swallowed hard. "Thank you." She hung up, but her hand stayed against the receiver for a few seconds as if she needed to hold on to something solid before she turned to face Walter fully. "Someone paid off your medical bills." Her voice trembled slightly, but her eyes were locked onto his, as if waiting for him to process it. Walter didn't move. The words hit him, but they didn't register immediately. It was too big, too sudden. His medical bills weren't small. They had been drowning under them for months, adjusting everything about their lives just to keep up with the payments. It had been their reality for so long that the idea of them being gone felt impossible. His voice was hoarse when he finally spoke. "Who?" Helen shook her head. "They wouldn't say. The payment was made last night. Full amount. The hospital confirmed it." Walter felt himself lower into the chair again, his body suddenly too heavy to hold up. He ran a hand through his hair, his heartbeat loud in his ears. "No, that doesn't make sense." Helen wiped at her eyes, though she was smiling through the shock. "We both know who it was." Walter's jaw tightened. He did know. He didn't want to believe it, but deep down, he already did. Leonardo DiCaprio. Not only had he paid for their dinner without a second thought, but he had somehow found out about the medical bills. And instead of walking away and forgetting the night like so many others would have, he had done something no one else would have even considered. Walter looked down at his hands. Why would he do that? His voice was barely above a whisper. Helen exhaled softly. Because he could. Walter's throat tightened. He had spent his entire life taking care of things on his own, making sure his family never had to depend on anyone else, carrying every burden in silence so no one else had to feel the weight of it. And now, in one night, a stranger, someone who owed them nothing, had done what he had spent years trying to do. Not just helping, restoring their dignity. Walter let out a slow breath, shaking his head in quiet disbelief. He had been too proud to accept it last night, too stubborn to acknowledge the weight of it even this morning. But now, sitting at this table, realizing just how much had been lifted off their shoulders, he couldn't deny the truth anymore. It wasn't charity. It wasn't about making them feel small. It was about letting them breathe again. Helen placed her hand over his. What are you thinking? Walter exhaled. I don't know. He swallowed, his voice rough. I don't know how to live without this weight. Helen smiled softly. Then maybe it's time to stop carrying it. Walter looked at her, and for the first time in a long time, he felt something shift. He wasn't sure what came next, but for the first time in a long time, he wasn't afraid to find out.